Welcome to the New America Foundation. Obviously a lot to talk about today with the announcement that General Petraeus will take over from General McChrystal. And couldn't have a better person to be talking about the two most challenging theaters, arguably in the Afghan war, Helmand and Kandahar, than my friend Stephen Gray, who is one of the leading investigative journalists in Britain. He wrote the book Ghost Plane, which I think was arguably one of the most important books of the War on Terror, because it really showed how exactly the CIA rendition program worked. And Stephen used a very ingenious method to basically work this out. He had a computer program analyst's notebook, which looked at literally hundreds of thousands of pieces of data about flight planes of various potential CIA flight plans around the world, and was able to isolate something like 300, I think, CIA flights in Europe itself. And basically, without knowing where these planes were going, it was impossible to tell where people were being rendered. So Stephen played a critical role in uncovering arguably one of the most secret programs the United States has ever been involved in. And now he's brought those investigative skills to bear on Helmand and Kandahar. And Stephen's most recent book, Snakebite, Operation Snakebite, is a brilliant account of the British campaign in Helmand, which obviously had a lot of problems. He's written in Foreign Policy magazine for the AFPAC channel an account of that, of an overall account of what the British did in Helmand. The British government has responded with their own account, challenging some of what Stephen said. Both of those are outside on the table. Stephen is formerly, he's with the Sunday Times right now as a foreign correspondent. He's written for a wide variety of papers in the United States. He's also written for the New York Times quite a lot during the rendition program period. So with that, Stephen will speak for about half an hour, then we'll go to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for coming today. And I know your minds will be on the resignations today, appointment of General McChrystal. I'm sorry that I wrote my remarks before that happened, but I'm sure we'll debate that in questions. I'm no soldier, but I have seen them in action quite a bit in Helmand and elsewhere in Iraq, and certainly spent probably far too much time among the ranks of soldiers and the generals. And as a reporter, the bond that you forge with the military makes it sometimes hard to portray, I think, their endeavours with a cold eye. To describe their faults can seem sometimes like a betrayal when these are the same people who've saved your life, as indeed British soldiers, American Special Forces, troops and Marines have most definitely saved my life in combat. But I do think that's the duty we have, because I don't think we owe that we do anything to help earn the sacrifice that people make if we don't try and look at it in a dispassionate way, because unless what happens is successful, all that sacrifice, including people very close to me and others that I'm sure you know, is for nothing. The book I've written, Operation Snakebite, let's just see if I can get this to work. That's me and my alter ego as a war reporter, and that's the book there. The book I wrote is a snapshot of one particular battle in Helmand. It's the liberation of the town of Musa Qala, where I was present, and at the time it was quite a shocking time. I had never been to Helmand before, and on the first day I was out there, 4 days after being in my little office in London, I was being sort of ambushed in the open field, watching civilians being killed by British and American soldiers by accident, and then the next day one of the platoon I was with was killed by a mine blast, and it was quite a emotional and difficult, shocking experience. But I tried to sort of unpick what had been going on there, and the more I looked into it, the more interesting it was to me to get behind and sort of unpeel all the different layers of what was happening in this war. And I chose, rather than to try and investigate the sort of whole war, just to pick on that battle and all the events that surrounded it, in order to try and understand the conflict we're in. This is just that's the sort of the main graphic of the actual kinetic fight, the battle, but that's only one level to what happened here. It's probably the biggest sort of set piece engagement there has been in southern Afghanistan, in this certainly in Helmand, in this war so far. But what lay behind that was a change of strategy that was going on at the time in Helmand, and which actually included probably most of the main elements of what became more recently known as the McChrystal strategy. Everything from putting making the focus the population and not the enemy, to integrating political and military action, to making a focus on integration with the other side, reintegration of the Taliban. And there was a whole backstory behind this about which motivated this battle, revolving around an alleged Taliban commander that wanted to change sides. It also struck me, and that's what made it interesting to cover this and dig into this, was I thought I'd sort of come at an interesting moment. It seemed like a crossroads, an army that was in the process of change. Having reported also in Iraq and seen the way the American and British militaries had changed, it struck me that rather like the army of the Potomac at Gettysburg, this was not the army that began the war on terror. This is very different. And I thought that, and I noticed that at a ground level, from so many people I spoke to, there was a new generation of people who'd now found themselves in the military through these conflicts, and were now changing and adapting what they were doing, and putting a great deal of pressure on top leadership to adapt what was happening. So in many ways, I think it was quite an iconic battle and an important part of understanding what is actually going on in Afghanistan. And it, for me, has been an object lesson of where things need to go, but also how difficult they are to put into effect, because all is not right in Musa Qala, the place that was taken 2.5 years ago and then I describe. When I was last there was a bubble about 2 miles north and 2 miles south of the town, and if you patrolled north of that area, then you'd be shot at. The population has not been won over to support neither the government nor NATO. So let me just tell you about the... So in meeting members of the military, what I found was, and I see people who react and get very angry from government people or whatever, when you lay out the weaknesses and what's gone wrong with the campaign, as somehow sort of demoralising the campaign and the soldiers, and undermining the efforts of cheerleaders for what's going on. But I found those who care the most about the war and actually make a success of involvement in Afghanistan are those prepared to criticise the most, because it's obvious that things are not working and that you need to lay out why and try and look into why in order to change course, to try and see what can be done. I'll just talk you through the basics of Helmand. This may all be familiar to you, but I think it's only without thinking about the geography and the sort of history of the place that, very briefly, that you can understand what's happening. This just shows you the little purple dots there, show you the villages in Helmand, and you'll see there this is basically a what happened there, I don't know. Right, it's a desert state It's the largest province in Afghanistan in the south. The yellow line is the border with Pakistan. But everything is concentrated around the River Helmand. It's a narrow strip of irrigated land known as the Green Zone. It's both the Helmand and sort of tributaries of the Helmand, and it gets more populous in the north, but also more mountainous. That's the water system, and again you can see that also shows Kandahar, similar concentration around the river areas. That's the Green Zone, which is the irrigated land, as seen from the desert. That's right close in the height of the summer when it's you can see the combat conditions there, and this is the Helmand Desert. The fighting takes place in the Green Zone. Both sides manoeuvre through the desert. Probably very hard to see for most of you actually here, but this is actually a slide of the satellite picture of the Korangal Valley, which is in the north of Afghanistan, the northeast of Afghanistan. The point there, which you really can't see on this, but is that mountains make for much more concentrated development. You'll see that the settlements are clustered around the roads. And in terms of counterinsurgency, the idea of separating the population from the people, it makes for a very different campaign. Whereas in Helmand, this is the upper Goresh Valley, that's between the town of Goresh and Sangin. You'll see that the people live in lots of scattered compounds. And again, this is in the Nadali area, which is actually the district which Marja is actually within. Lots of scattered compounds. It means that just to control the main centres of population, the towns, doesn't get you very far in terms of controlling the population. That's the difficulty of operating in this area. So let me just quickly talk you through what's actually been happening in Helmand. The plan was to arrive with a very counterinsurgency focused campaign geared to the population. That was in 2005. The British arrived in 2006. The idea was to focus on a Helmand development zone in the centre. Instead, the plan was torn up when the governor of Helmand, Sheikh Mohammed Akhundzada, was under British pressure, sacked. He was regarded like Ahmed Wali Karzai now is in Kandahar as corrupt and involved in the drugs trade. And Karzai sacked him. And then 6 months later, allowing a time for rebellion to take shape and for militias who had kept security to be stood down, rebellion developed. So by the summer of 2006, when the British arrived, there was all kinds of revolts taking place. The British then had quite a small force, amounting to only about 9 platoons in the beginning, and they deployed north to various towns of northern Helmand. This here is Lashkargah in the centre, the capital. This only shows the northern part of Helmand at the moment. The town of Musakala that I write about, Nowzad, Kajaki, where there's a large dam, and Sangin, which is about halfway up there. And the north became the focus of the British campaign. But they never had enough troops to do anything other than hold those places, and their presence helped to both be a magnet for the Taliban, but also to inspire a more general revolt by local people who resented the presence of foreigners. The result was a very violent campaign where the British dug into these town centres, and an awful lot of bombs were dropped, and a lot of damage was caused to people's property. The town of Nowzad became a ghost town. There was great destruction in the town centres of Musakala and Sangin. A lot of people fled. All around Kajaki became a ghost town. Down Garmsir was abandoned completely by its population, and there were a lot of refugees came into Lashkargah and Goresh. It was a terrible disaster and turned an awful lot of people against the foreigners. And gradually, that campaign in the following years has escalated. The British have sent increasing numbers of troops to garrison these places, and they did so over the following years, but never enough to meet the threat that was there, or really to dominate the area they were in. We also were confronted, so there was always an under-resourced, although I call it more of an overstretch, because what we're talking about is tailoring the resources available to what was actually required, because there's such a large area of I think someone pointed out that the whole of the southern region of Afghanistan is larger than South Vietnam, and with the number of troops deployed, it's never possible to occupy every single district or village. The question is how to decide what is a goal that needs to be taken. What you had was a very conventional campaign that sought to take on the Taliban, break their backs. There was a lot of talk about a break-in battles, trying to put the Taliban off balance, and there were successive summers and winters of sweeps up and down these valleys between Sangin, with the idea being to try and clear this whole area, just a vast area here, between Kajaki, Sangin, and Goreshk. And the troops used to call it mowing the lawn. Go into a place, drive out the Taliban, and then withdraw. They didn't have the resources to hold these places, and the Taliban would come back, and the population would be very resentful for what had happened, because what had they got out of it? There was one place called Hyderabad, which that interested me because it was the place that the forces of Ayub Khan crossed the Helmand in, I think it was 1890, to go and defeat the British in the Battle of Maiwand. And this little village, I kept coming across people, American Special Forces, 82nd Airborne, paratroopers, and British, who'd all cleared this one village. So I reckon it had been cleared about 12 times and was still left in the hands of the Taliban. So you can see why people were pretty resentful about what we were doing. A lot of people said to me, put it in very conventional terms, that people wanted to see who was the strongest force. The Afghans are sitting on the fence, I was told. They want to see who's the strongest. Well, I thought a more sensible view was that this is not a game of gladiators. The Afghan population were not sitting on the fence as spectators. They were living in this war. And what they wanted was who would provide permanent security. As a way of delivering that, from about the spring of 2000, from the end of 2007, 2008, there was an attempt to provide more durable security, to go away from mowing the lawn, with the creation of a series of, and you'll see them here, because this is a snapshot of the end of 2007, a whole series of bases all the way up and down the Helmand River. But there was never enough people to actually hold that territory, and there never will be. The population is too dispersed, and just simply building a fort doesn't stop your enemies driving straight past you, doesn't provide you with the ability to control what's happening in the valleys around. And then, in the already overstretched, what we saw in the fall of 2008 was an extension of the campaign, where this central area, you'll see there, no bases at all marked. That's because it was broadly peaceful. It also happened to be the biggest area of opium production. Some rather chaotic and ill-judged eradication programs, combined with a failure to understand what was going on tribally there, led to an extension of violence into this area. The British moved into that area again and stretched themselves even further. That's the area of Nad Ali, about here, which is the focus now of the British campaign. And there was a lot of naive talk about this rebellion spreading, and one of the reasons was because the US Marines had now arrived in Helmand, and they'd moved into the town of Garmsir, taken this back. And it was said, oh, well, the Taliban have fled north into this area, and that's why it's all turned into a new fighting zone. It was all called it was an operation to clear a Taliban stronghold. It was a Taliban stronghold we'd not heard of before, because that area had not been a place where they'd been fighting. So rather than confront a Taliban force that existed that we've struggled to contain, I think we stirred up a revolt here. we failed to contend with the dynamics of what was happening locally. For example, in the town of Sangin, there were two major tribes. There are two major tribes, the Alakozai and the Ishakzai. They were getting rich on the opium production. And when we arrived in 2006, we were seen as coming on the side that was broadly with the government, the Alakozai. And not surprisingly, who was seen to be trying to corner the drugs market, the Ishakzai, the other tribe, turned to the Taliban for protection. So we've been seen to take sides in a drugs war. Similarly, in the centre of Helmand, the police worked with the Nurzai tribe, dominant in that area, to marginalise and seize the revenues of the Gilzai, a different tribal grouping that was in the same area, and they turned to the Taliban. And that's the sort of issue that we haven't grappled with. So you had the arrival of US Marines, and they came in strength last summer with what the British called Panther's claw, Americans called Operation Strike of the Sword. Now you might have thought that with all those under-resourced areas in the north, they might have moved to support what the British were doing. But no, there was a line very artificially drawn between the British and American forces in the centre of Helmand, and the Americans pushed south. They seized just south of Natalie. They moved into Garmsir, spread south. They took the Nawa district, and they took this place in Karnashin that I went to last October. It was a medieval type place, I believe feudal, where I don't think much of the sort of counterinsurgency book is in any way effective, because dishing out promises and hope to individuals does not work in a collective society where everything depends on tribal, feudal leaders, Khans, in fact, most of whom seem to live in Pakistan with their drugs revenue. But most of all, what we saw was a dissipation again of resources. This is the most faraway place you'd ever want to be, Karnashin, and it was absolutely wonderful to see what these people were doing. But I thought, why on earth are they there when there's people losing their lives, absolutely sweating up in the north, completely under-resourced in a vital part of Helmand, protecting the road up to the strategic Kajaki Dam, and we've dispatched people in all directions. And when it came down to it, it came down to these sort of national sensitivities, who goes where. And when I went up to Kabul to talk to the ISAF people, and I said, well, why the hell have you gone to Karnashin? They said, you're right, why the hell have we gone to Karnashin? And I was like, you're in charge, aren't you? But anyway. So I think a widespread view on that, but a lot of this is NATO, and there's a lot of sensitivities about dividing things up. What I saw is a campaign that was dissipated. So I think that the picture now, there is progress. There are things. There's been the final point, obviously, is the further operations this spring going into the southern part of Nadali, which is called Marja. It's not a city as described quite often in leading papers. It's quite a small area, a few hamlets, but it had become a concentration of people fighting the government, but still nothing like the numbers of the resources to try and deliver long-term benefits for people, and to actually engage with what people want, which is a government which is on their side. We are seen as being on the wrong side, as far as I can tell. I'd sum up just a few conclusions on Helmand. First of all, intelligence. I think we've had bad intelligence, and that intelligence we've had, we haven't really acted upon, looking at the basis of why people are fighting. Secondly, we adopted a very manoeuvrist approach. Every British certain tour and every, I think, American tour, Marine tour so far has involved one major operation. There seems to be a great desire for that great action. We've never had enough troops to dominate. Afghan forces that have been there have either been inadequate or insincerely involved. There's never been a true leadership. We don't make heroes of them. They're never allowed to run their own operations. Even now, we are trying to create an Afghan force in the mirror image of a Western army, and I don't think that will work. I think Afghans are good fighters, but probably not very good fighters in a Western model. The civilian surge has not happened. There are enormous numbers. There are people doing great things on the civilian side, but they've never been able to wrestle the point which they're there for, which is delivering good government. We have a very centralized, Soviet-designed government which we've chosen to follow, model of government in the Bonn Accords, and we've not dealt with that. Everything comes back to Kabul. We've injected resources at Kabul that have not reached to the ground level. And until government is reformed to actually be relevant to the very local and individual issues that exist on the ground, then I don't think it will put what we're doing on the side of right. It's a side issue, but I also believe we've had a very misguided special forces campaign which has involved taking down and destroying leadership of the insurgents, the people that ultimately that represent locally the leadership, tribal leadership in many of these valleys and towns, and ultimately these are the people that we're going to have to do a deal with that will be key to our withdrawal. Simply removing them rejuvenates the insurgency, makes it more extreme. I believe I think it's a short-term approach to that. And ultimately, what we deliver is a promise of something in the future. The problem is we don't actually know if we can deliver it. We say we're going to stay. We don't know politically if we will stay. It's very hard in the short term to explain why people should support us. There was someone involved in the planning of Operation Panther's Claw who laid out to me, he said to me, if we're being really honest, I thought at the time, this is what we'd tell people as we went into this area. First of all, sorry, this is what we're good at. That's the situation roughly in the north of Helmand. The south isn't right, where after 3.5 years of fighting, this is around Sang. Blue is, well, the bits that NATO controls. Red is Taliban dominated. This is the area around Musakala, this is the area around Nauzad, this is around Kajaki. Everywhere else, largely Taliban dominated. It's better, this is the north, it's better further south. But you can see that's been the focus of the British campaign. You can see why people who've been there a lot can get quite depressed. The downside, this is what you'd tell people if you're being straight, according to one officer involved in that operation. What will be the consequences of this operation? We'll probably bring you at least 4 years of war. We'll bring collateral damage. We'll try not to kill you, but we may destroy some of your homes. We'll bring you a slower and less efficient system of justice than you've been used to from the Taliban. And security will probably deteriorate in the short term. And we might threaten your livelihoods, the poppy production. So quite a hard sell. And in return, the upside, the future. We bring you a hope of a future sharing benefits of government, social and economic development, and durable security. And you know, a lot of people still buy what we do because they do look to the future. But you can see how hard it is to sell that one. And one of the issues that I think is not just about the theory of it all. I think there's a lot of focus on, the latest counterinsurgency theory, Mark 14.7 or whatever it is. But to my mind, what a lot of it comes down to is competence. Are we able to deliver what we set out to do? Do we have the people to do it and the resources to do it? You see a lot of people say we must engage the tribes. How many people do we have who can do that? Or even know who to use to get someone else to do it? That's what I think we struggle with. And I'd just like to show you a little video that I made, it's just 5 minutes, about one issue, which is an issue of languages, which I think is really only serves to underline the wider problem of competence, about whether delivering this vast garrison of forces across southern Afghanistan can do the trick in what we want to achieve. So if that works, I should watch that.
Thousands of American troops are heading into Afghanistan.
41 Romeo.
They're fighting a fierce enemy, the Taliban, that ambushes them at every corner.
If you can lift the volume, that we can.
And leaves the fields and towns laced with chemical explosives. US troops are fighting back.
You see that I have a big capacity to make war.
But the bigger strategy is to defeat the Taliban by winning the population away from the enemy, and to do this by offering incentives.
But I promise you, I have a bigger capacity to make peace.
If you can go ahead and count that.
On the ground, I attached myself to Marines of the 2nd Light Armoured Reconnaissance Regiment, who arrived as McChrystal took over.
Hey, Safi.
The Marines are inviting people to come to a shura, that's a gathering of elders. It's been called by the Americans to tell them about a plan to open a school.
Have you heard about the shura that we're going to have soon? On Friday, in 2 days, at 10 o'clock.
The Marines find this work can be frustrating. This is a feudal society here, and people refer big questions to the tribal chiefs, known as the Khans, who own the land here and rule the people.
What
kind of things would you like to see us help you with?
ككلينيك ودري أما خاني دري كمدرسة ودري أما خاني دري مش خداش مسكينام خلق داش مش تيتنا سوالا تشتي أطمن كلينيك خان كما كتاب جورك هم ورت مجبوري.
With no joy from the villagers, we go off to meet the tribal Khan. It's him who will decide if the shura is a success.
I just want to talk to him.
Sergeant Richardson is doubtful of the Khan's attitude, but like most foreign soldiers, he's hampered by not speaking the local language.
You're not telling the people and the leaders and elders of this area about it.
The Marines depend on interpreters to get the message across.
Says that why are you upset about it? Why?
I'm not upset. It's gonna be a problem for us because it's sure for tomorrow. It's to help you guys out. So you guys got to be there.
He says that we cannot post advertisements that there is a council going on Friday.
What the Khan is trying to get across is that with Taliban spies about, it would be dangerous to advertise a meeting with the Americans a week in advance. This kind of subtle message is getting lost in translation.
So he's saying a week. It's not a good time frame. Like it's not long enough. So is that what he's trying to tell me?
I asked what people here really think of the recent arrival of American troops.
The
At the shura organised by Sergeant Ritchie's men, the elders and their tribal chiefs do turn up.
I wanted to bring us all together here today, so that way we could talk about our issues.
They explain their problems.
We haven't shot anybody from Coptain. We've never shot from Coptain.
Captain Christopher Connor tries to deliver the American message, but he doesn't realise that, due to poor translation, his words are not always getting through.
You should know that the words that I speak are true. If I had evil in my heart, things would be a lot different, like when the Russians were here. You see that I have a big capacity to make war. But I promise you, I have a bigger capacity to make peace.
The trouble is the translator is speaking in his native Persian, as well as trying to speak Pashtun. Unfortunately, half the villagers here only speak a third language, Baluch.
If there are things that are a concern to you with bandits, criminals, drug smugglers, Taliban, then you should come to us. Because in the end, we are all living here together.
So Kandahar, if you can bring the PowerPoint back. I just come back from a few weeks in. Well, it was in March and April. I was in Kandahar province, trying to understand what's happening there with the new offensive that was then planned, or non-offensive. So it's no longer. I think it's called a complex military and political effort. I saw it referred to in the New York Times. I was in the city with U.S. forces there, and I was in the embedded with a unit in the Arghandab Valley, just outside the city, with a unit of paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne that I'd known from before, and I was also unembedded, living in a hotel in the city, in the centre of Kandahar, which was an interesting perspective. I'll be very brief there because I know that I'm sort of gone on too long, but just a few points about what's going on there. First of all, you may have read that it's a Taliban stronghold, which I think is an absolute nonsense. The Taliban are free to move around here, but it is, you should think of it more like Saigon in the Vietnam War, or Palermo. The government is still here, or rather those who claim to be allies of the government, and they hold the checkpoints and positions of government. So the Taliban can move around, but they don't actually control the place, which means there's nowhere actually to attack, which is why they don't call it an offensive anymore. But it is a city under siege that is threatened to be dominated by the Taliban and by revolt. Actually, I think that I was pretty impressed by the assessment that commanders were making of the situation, which was that the place was run by what was called malign influences. I think one of them I've got a slide of. There we are, Armed Wali Karzai. But it's not just him. There are other warlords, and the point is that power is in the hands of a few. Certain tribes get much more influence. There are strong men, armed men, militias, who have dominated government and have been seen to be in alliance with us. So thinking has evolved, and I think that reflects partly why this operation has been delayed and delayed, because it's much more complex than the Taliban. And I've been impressed actually by how much that point has got across. I don't think it's well understood back home, as it were. I saw a report last week that the governor of the Arghandab, who was working with the unit I was with, the 82nd Airborne, 2nd Battalion 508, was murdered. I don't know if you saw the piece about counterinsurgency in the New York Times magazine. There's a big picture of the local American commander, Guy Jones, and this district governor. And he was assassinated last week, which is pretty sad. But interesting, got an email this morning from a source in Kandahar involved in all this, who said the latest thinking was not the Taliban at all. This was a mob hit. There are forces there that we are challenging that have very little to do with the Taliban. So the big issue is how to take power from the bad guys, how to make government in southern Afghanistan and its capital, Kandahar, an attractive proposition. Now, one approach is to lecture the president, and that's been tried on numerous occasions. There's a lot of talk about empowering Karzai, disempowering Karzai, but I fail to see how he actually can have the influence to change things on the ground there. Precinct councils, that's the great idea. That's the only element of the plan. And I said I admired the analysis. What I found missing was an actual plan to use the military forces at our disposal, or any forces at our disposal, to actually solve this problem, and that's the missing bit. What is the role for the military? It's not very clear. How can they tackle this very political problem and deal with these power brokers? There's a lot of talk about creating third forces. That's the big debate at the moment. We know how weak the Afghan army is, how dominated it is by Pashtuns from the north and Tajiks from the north. It's not going to be a force that can win people over in the south. So people are doing all kinds of experiments, particularly special forces, and standing up all kinds of militias in villages, Pashtun forces, and it could be a very important idea, but the experiment has great dangers, and we're already seeing how it has meant that the rearming of militias, which are actually what turned people to Taliban in the first place. So what can we do there? Well, I'd argue that one of the things that we can do is actually look at what effect we're having in these places. I think that wherever we've gone, we seem to have stirred things up. The question mark is, what role do all these conventional forces, these tens of thousands of people we're deploying there, actually do in making things better? We have a huge logistical tail, and if you ask people why they don't find what we're doing credible in tackling the so-called malign forces that are seen as the root of the problem and are turning people to Taliban, it's because we're the ones that are using them and propping them up. The reason they're wealthy is because we support them. I think it came out in a report by the House of Representatives this week called Warlord Inc., which I think was a pretty good report about how logistics, paying for convoys to move, results in the arming of warlords, but it's also who we hire to provide our translators, who guards the bases, who provides intelligence to the various different agencies wandering around, who are the Afghan forces that work alongside American special forces and other countries' special forces. In almost all cases, they are the militias run by these malign influences, and we haven't tackled that. So, in conclusion, this is a long campaign that demands a politically sustainable approach, and I don't think we're there yet. There's a need to engage with what's happening at a village level, with the micro demands of the Afghan people. And I'm not sure that conventional forces deployed in their tens of thousands that we are doing at the moment are the right way forces forward. I think the solution does involve reconciliation, involves village-level political solutions, which are essential before villages are turned into militia bases. You have to bring the tribes together before you just arm one local group. And it also demands a regional political solution that deals with some of the outside forces that are also involved. And the Afghans really have to be in control of all this. We just can't do most of this stuff. I'll just end with a quote from my favourite film, Chinatown. Evelyn Mulray. It's an innocent question. He's asking what he does. Jake Gittis, in Chinatown. What are you doing there? Working for the district attorney. Doing what? As little as possible. The district attorney gives his men advice like that. They do in Chinatown. I think McChrystal would have been wise to give now Petraeus similar advice in Kandahar. Do as little as possible until you know what you're doing is going to do some good. Thank you.
So, about 3 minutes of Q&A, and then Stephen will sign some books outside. The first question I had was, I guess is what you seem to be advocating is sort of actually not going into Helmand at all in the first place, perhaps, and perhaps not even going into Kandahar. It's essentially doing nothing. That seems to be the burden of what you've presented today. And I do the thought experiment where the 10,000 Marines hadn't gone into Helmand and where the British hadn't gone into Helmand, and try and paint for us a picture of what Helmand would look like today. And as a sort of sub-part of that question, what did the Americans do different from the British in Helmand? Good, bad, or indifferent? Mm-hmm. And if you were in charge in either place, but particularly Helmand, which you didn't address, what would you be doing differently?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm not against. I have certainly criticised the way that the engagement has taken place, but I'm not against the deployment per se. I just believe that it should have been much more subtle and lighter. And I think that the actual original plan for Helmand, which involved the plan of the Defence Secretary was his hope that they wouldn't fire a single bullet. that was perhaps misconstrued, but it was actually the thought was right, actually, to concentrate on delivering a better government in the centre of Helmand and not chasing the Taliban around. I mean, there is an idea of the ink spot of counterinsurgency. Concentrate, never mind other places are taken over by insurgents, show people what's good and what can work. And I just don't think it's been actually tried. Everything has been dissipated. It demands enormous resources, and they have to be concentrated. And those that are concentrated have to be people who are capable of doing that. So I'd just argue for a lighter, more sensitive involvement. But there are times when it is best just to let people do their thing. I think the German approach has been underrated. Sometimes sitting in your base. John Lawrence, I forgot his first name, Lawrence anyway, a former Viceroy of India, defined that policy as the best one for Afghanistan. He called it masterful inactivity. The idea being, it's this kind of Hippocratic theory of counterinsurgency: first, do no wrong. And I think that there is, I think that there's a rush that's been given into pressure, political pressure from. That's the story of Helmand, giving into political pressure from Karzai to sort of wrest back these various towns, and that's been, I think, a big problem. What would I do different? That was the point. Your question. The difference between Americans and British. I think the differences are kind of generally overrated. I think that both are adapting on their feet. I've shown you stuff that went wrong down in Kandahar. I'm sure that they just started there. I'm sure they're getting a lot better. There's a lot of good things happening in the centre of Helmand at the moment. People are trying to deal with these, recognising that there's a lot it all comes down to local tribal dynamics, which explains why people are fighting, and they're trying to engage with that. I just don't think they have the number of, culturally competent people to make a strategic impact, and I think they're spread too thinly. The Americans, there are a lot of, there are people I admire from both armies who are really engaged with these issues, and I think who, despite what's said publicly, a lot of what I said there reflects the views of a lot of people who are actually there, who kind of write to me quite a lot about it. So.
Sort of another related question is, I was embedded in Helmand in last September, and the Marines, one thing that was surprising to me was how safe it was. And that was sort of, we were in Nawa district, and we may have been sort of snookered into going there by the very capable Marines, public affairs people, because it was so safe. Now, the Marine officer that we were with said that of the 13 districts in Helmand, 12 were no longer controlled by the Taliban. Is that a plausible number? And is Helmand safer today than it was, say, in 2007? Is it easier to travel around?
In the 2000, yeah. You're talking about the height. Yes, it is easier to travel around in certain areas. That figure is incorrect in the sense that it applies to district centres. They have forts, and they are securing at great cost markets and central centres of population. Lashkar, for example, has become much safer and much more under control, which is the provincial capital, as it has Goreshk, but the countryside has become more insecure. So I don't think it's an accurate description. Also, the large presence of foreign troops may mean that it's sort of safe to move around in the daytime, but that doesn't mean the Taliban aren't threatening people at night. There is no doubt that Nawa has been quite a success story, but I think you have to remember in context that these were areas where there wasn't fighting before, where the requirement to dispatch all these Marines to secure this area reflects an expanding population, and also expanding insurgency, and also the fact that Helmand is only one district province within a very large cauldron of conflict, where the very large presence of American troops can mean that it's tactically helpful for insurgents to do most of their activities elsewhere, and to go underground, to move from a very kinetic, overt campaign to a campaign of underground resistance and intimidation. They've got plenty of time.
Great. In the back, and if you ask a question, could you identify yourself? We have a microphone, so just wait for the mic. If we go to the back, right to the back. Thanks.
I'm Adam Holloway. I'm a friend of Stephen Gray's. Stephen, we're told that the exit strategy is Afghan national security forces extending the writ of the Afghan central government across the countryside, and once that's done, we can go. What do you think of that?
As I said in the talk, I think we are pretty wedded at the moment to the Soviet model. In fact, most of the people that we appoint to these jobs are just referred to locally as communists, because that's the generation of people we're putting in power. The people all sent off to Moscow, wherever else, to get educated. That's the system we are enforcing, a very centralized system where every appointment ultimately goes back to the president. There isn't local democracy, but more to the point, it's not a sort of traditional big tent consensus. It's not about democracy. It's such about the way in which you achieve consensus to support the regime you have. So I don't think that is what we're doing. It's a very centralized thing, and I think people are waking up now that this good governance has to be achieved one tribe at a time, as I think one former special forces person put it. Right.
There's a few in the front here.
Hi, my name is Tony Drexler. I'm an international public health consultant. And I know you've spoken a little bit about the need for a more sensitive approach in both of these areas. I wonder if you would have any examples of institution building or of national-led development, national-led security, specifically perhaps the use of the National Solidarity Program or the National Health Program or the NGO community.
Yeah, I believe that people say it, and I believe it's true, that the National Solidarity Program, which is about villagers defining their own priorities and receiving development funds once they've put together a plan, is one of the most successful things going. Although it's not very successful in Helmand at the moment, I think, because it's too insecure to provide those solutions. I think it's a big problem. We've militarized development. One of the consequences of giving such a priority to population-focused development and human security, if you like, as part of the sort of military strategy, is you militarize those things, and you turn schools effectively into legitimate targets because they become a means for you to secure support, and they're naturally targeted, and also you make it dangerous for non-military people to go, NGOs and that sort of thing, to operate. I think one important development which has taken place, which is a positive one, is a recognition that you're not going to win people over with treasure. And not everyone recognises that. If you go to any of these shuras, it's just a kind of bribe handout quite often. It's just endless. Oh, what do you want? Yeah, no problem. Or this. I think the American Twin has got $15,000 a month to spend just on looking after itself. Never mind, the formal development funds. But I think that doesn't work in terms of securing support, and nor does the bigger scale development project, because the country's littered with Soviet white elephants. They built clinics and they did all kinds of development schemes, and that doesn't. It is basically a more broader security, the sense of a resolution of local political conflict and a dealing with the wider economic issues. I mean, I think a bigger plan for how people are supposed to earn a living, that is something that would win people's support, as opposed to, bit by bit development, which people say, thank you very much, but doesn't mean we support you, we'll take that if we want it. One of the comments made to me by a colonel just back from running a battalion in the south, he said, we've got our approach so much better, but there's still really no joined-up plan. It's still a case of well-meaning colonels like me sitting with a whiteboard and working out the future for this area, that isn't the way, a sort of joined-up way that you're going to win here, because we need to have a plan to say how it is we move from this opium economy, which is driving this place into conflict as these tribes compete for the, which include the government, compete for this this drugs revenue, to a more stable situation where people have legitimate jobs and there isn't that plan in place. So, back to your point about we shouldn't be there. My point is not so much we shouldn't be there. It's just that when I read, and I was in Iraq a lot, but I wasn't there in the middle of the Baghdad search. But from what I've read of it, my impression is that there were examples of success which gave a pointer to how things could be turned for the better. So we reinforced success. We saw ways to move forward, and then we reinforced it. I just question whether the whole surge has been premature, that we've actually moved too fast in delivering so many resources there, which are not politically sustainable back here. There's only a limited public support there's going to be for that degree of commitment.
Thank you so much. I'm Ashokula from Voice of America Afghanistan Service. I have actually two questions. The first one is about Helmand province. It was in 2006 under General David Richards when it was decided that some troops, international troops, have to be sent to Helmand province. I have spoken to the governor, then governor of Helmand province, Sher Ahmad Akhundzada. As you said, he said any troops, but not the British, if they have been sent to Afghanistan, to Helmand province, that would have changed the situation to better, not to worse. The people opposed with the sending of British forces, but they sent it anyway. Do you think that was a mistake by the ISAF forces sending not other countries but British to Helmand province? It is the first question. The second question is about the translators, as you said. I used to be a translator for US forces in Afghanistan, and I have seen examples where Iranians are now sent to Afghanistan, and they are Iranians from Iran.
Yeah.
As to be interpreters for the US forces, and they go particularly to the south, where people don't speak Persian at all. They would understand Dari, which is the Afghan dialect, but they don't speak that language as well. They speak Persian only. And these people are hired by a Mission Essential program here in the United States, given high salaries. Why is the United States not recognizing this problem?
Okay.
Thank you.
Actually, David Richards argued that it was wrong to send the British to Helmand, but he warned against the fact that there was this memory of this Battle of Maiwand and the previous British attempts to go there, and that there might be some folk memory of this, and there is. But still, I think that Maiwand is actually halfway between Kandahar and Lashkar. I'm not terribly convinced. I mean, I sort of feel that no one's getting it. No one is emerging brilliantly, from all this, and I think that there are some really good examples of where the British are experimenting to try and get things right, and it's not. I think if people will, whilst people, I think you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think generally speaking, Afghans are fairly prejudiced against foreign armies, whatever shape they come in, So I'm not convinced that it would make that much difference, really, whether
I'm not convinced by it. Even in the BBC poll that just came out, 63% of Afghans had a favourable view of international forces, which is an astonishing number. I mean, 63% of people on the Upper West Side in New York probably don't have a favourable view of the US military. So, what are these poll numbers wrong? Because it's such a common view to say that Afghans don't like foreigners. Yet the polling has been going on since 2005. We now have 5 years of nationwide polling by the BBC and ABC, and the numbers have drifted down from 85% favourable to 62%. But still, that's a very positive number. Now, in Helmand, it might be different. But why, you just stated it's a very common view. Why do you hold that view if the polling seems to contradict it?
Well, first of all, I'm talking about I don't know the detailed polling for sort of cauldron of conflict, if you like, in the south, because I would think that it would be different in the north, where obviously the foreign forces were crucial to defeating the Taliban. So I think in Kabul, where which was under kind of house arrest from the Taliban, I was there when the Taliban were there. So I thought that I'm not sure how the overall demographics are. I still think that the whole polling doesn't really fit. It doesn't seem right. I don't know the logic of it, but certainly the last poll I found incredible. This idea that everyone was feeling optimistic about the way things are going, because the facts about the spread of the insurgency contradict that. I'm very dubious about that poll, and I think everyone within ISAF I've met is also rather dubious that things look like that. That things look that good. So I think it'd be dangerous to clutch at that one. But why do I think it? Partly because it sort of explains what's going on, and secondly because there is no people I've ever met that who are in a situation who say bring on the foreigners, who say I wish NATO would be here. Just haven't ever heard that. On the translator issue, I just really endorse what you say. I don't know. I think there's some big money scandal going on there with the translators. Last time when I was in Kandahar, I travelled with an Afghan colleague because the translation is so bad when you travel with the military, because they get such a raw service. And that platoon I showed, they're really good guys, and they lost like half their platoon have been hit by IEDs. So I feel a bit bad, like sort of showing them up almost in that film, because I think they were trying to do a really good job, and they are really let down by not having those translators. And I travelled with this time with an Afghan colleague, so I get good translation, and we could work together. He didn't find a single person in the US military who spoke Pashtun, and they were working as Pashtunarian. They're all speaking Dari speakers, kids from Kabul who just didn't speak it. They spoke a few words, and all the time he was just whispering, actually they're being told the 100%, 180 degrees the opposite of what the guy's saying to them, and you makes you one doesn't you understand why there's so many misunderstandings.
My name is Ole Nielsen. I'm a journalist from Denmark covering Afghanistan. I have two questions for you. What is actually the difference between what the British, the Danes, and the Estonians have done for years in Helmand, and what the Americans are doing with the new strategy, which is focusing on the civilian side as well? And second question is, what is the situation in Musakala now and in Marja, which is very much disputed, what the situation is there? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I haven't spent time directly with the Danish forces in Helmand, so, but to be honest, I only hear good things about what's happening from what the Danes are doing, because they came with a focus that was non-kinetic, if you like. They were not trained. They were not trained and used to the level of fighting that the British forces probably were used to. So they were always very focused on the population. Where things have gone wrong, I hear second hand from those types of forces, is actually because they were unused to dealing with such a hot war. When things really got rough, they had a tendency to overreact. They've got, using main battle tanks up there, the Leopard tanks, I believe. They are unable to sort of find the middle ground and calibrate that sort of heavy response when it is required, because the level of attack is so intense. But everyone's learning in different ways, and it's been a struggle. I think that this is early days in this sort of campaign, even now, because we are measured by the way we react and learn from these sort of early periods. There's no expectation that anyone can be thrown into this alien environment and get it right. So it's the degree to which you debate and learn and pick up on all these errors that actually means whether you prevail or not. What's happening in Marja and Musakala, I don't know is the answer. I was last there in November. Everyone I spoke to in Kandahar said pretty much what has been reported now, which is that I think sort of 2 out of 3 markets in Marja were being controlled by the coalition forces, but that at night the Taliban were very, very present and were infiltrating back back in. Taliban people we spoke to said that they'd made a lot of errors there. They'd sort of responded to the call out when the Americans said that they were coming, and they came and met them, and a lot of them got killed. But that they are, creeping back in, and that it's too dangerous for people there really to sort of definitively side with the government. In Musa Qala, the U.S. Marines have taken that over from the British, and but I haven't heard yet. I know that there's been all kinds of fighting there, but I haven't heard yet what a good account of what difference the arrival of the U.S. Marines has made to that area.
Hi, thanks for your talk. Billy Freeland, a recent graduate of Columbia University. 2 questions. One, you spoke of reconciliation as being important, but I'm wondering if you pursue masterful inactivity, as you put it, how do you see reconciliation playing out? Because it would seem to me that there'd be very little incentive for the Afghan Taliban to reconcile in the face of masterful inactivity. And the second question about General McChrystal, he was known to have a very close relationship with President Karzai, and probably one of the better relationships of all American personnel. So I'm wondering, do you think General Petraeus can fill that void, or what sort of gap is going to be left by his departure? Thanks.
Yeah. I'm not arguing for wholesale stay behind in the base, otherwise there'd be no point sort of being there, but just that to act with caution and care and with deliberation before intervening. But I actually think that the people, it's not the case that you have all across the country there are people described as insurgents who are fighting, and we call them Taliban or different Taliban groups. But when you look at who's in them, by and large, I always ask, who's the local Taliban commander, the intelligence people I'm with, and almost invariably it's a local guy. So these are local tribesmen, local fighters that are engaged. So sort of partly that it's almost like if we're not there, sometimes there isn't a Taliban. It's actually there in reaction to us or to some national army unit or whatever foreign forces they think it's there. So there is a natural reconciliation that might flow from just being there. And if, for example, we hadn't been in Musa Qala, we hadn't gone up there, if the Taliban had taken that spot and held on to it, they took it back in February 2007. The British withdrew in end of, I think, September, October 2006. Taliban, it was a tribal group that took it. It was handed back in theory to the elders of the town. Most of them were related to the Taliban, the local Taliban, and then the main sort of Taliban went in February 2007. If that situation had continued, in some ways, first of all, it serves as an object lesson to the rest of the country of what it's like to be under Taliban rule. And I don't think it's the case. Just because everything's going badly in one place, it makes sense to rush in there. And secondly, there are powerful forces at work in these places. There are people with high connections. There's a lot of money being made from the drugs and other sources, and there are local incentives to bring tribes together. It's not as if you're dealing with a totally unarmed and helpless population that could never find a solution to deliver its own reconciliation. There are other means to deliver reconciliation than to send a column of armoured vehicles up there. The void. Someone? Oh, McChrystal, yes, of course, yeah. Well, I think it's a terrible tragedy, actually. I mean, as you can probably gather, I didn't say a fair bit about what I said today that doesn't really kind of reflect what is happening under McChrystal's watch, but I sort of figure that he was a very very open and thoughtful person who was one of the few people around who might find a way to deal with what's wrong with the strategy. I think it was evolving. It is evolving. The fact that he surrounded himself with unconventional people who were prepared to mouth off about everything was probably good. The fact he invited a Rolling Stone reporter to listen in on it all, perhaps unwise. So, I think it leads. I think it's a real big blow, at the moment, because psychologically it's very difficult. You know, a lot of what the sort of stuff I've been saying, you know, is being said within the command. You know, people are awake. You know, there is a sense things are not going quite well, and at this time to lose somebody who's actually kind of aware of this stuff and thinking through and has the ability to lead. You know, he wasn't very popular in McChrystal among the troops. They were mad about all the stuff to do with restriction, you know, responsive fire, escalation of force, all those measures calculated to reduce the number of civilian casualties. People felt that was putting American troops had done all these tours before, lost so many people before, that they were putting people in danger. I didn't find him very popular, but you know, the fact that everyone down to a unit level knew about these various directives from the commander told me that he was the first commander of NATO forces in Afghanistan to have seized control of this campaign. All these nations involved, US Marines at war with the American Army and American Army at war with US Special Forces. You know, he had the authority and was bringing the campaign together. Now, with all its faults, you know, so as I say, there's plenty I think that's been going wrong, but it's just quite hard to see where it goes from here. And I haven't, you know, read the latest on. I gather it's Petraeus, and I don't know Petraeus. I mean, I'd say he's got a big task. You know.
Let's we have a few more minutes, so let's just bunch 3 or 4 questions together. David Isby here in the front.
David Isby, Northern Helmand. How is Mullah Salam working out in Musa Qala? And secondly, after the event, does the movement of the well-publicized movement of generators to Kojaki, what are the after effects of that operation?
Okay, there's this gentleman here. Let's just bunch some together because we're going to run out of time otherwise.
Regarding that, the central idea of not being able to hold territory in Helmand, and as soon as you leave, the Taliban comes back. Does that concept apply to other provinces in the region, and does it apply to the country as a whole, in that as soon as we leave in 2011, or however long it takes to leave, will the Taliban immediately come back? And if this is true, doesn't it beg the question, what can we possibly do in the time frame that we've allotted ourselves, except for make things worse?
Hi there. I was just wondering if you could comment on how the AVIPA program is doing, because I've heard from some folks over there that that's actually a success story. AVIPA, A-V-I-P-A.
What is it?
It's an agricultural workers program where they hire local folks instead of the Taliban hiring them.
Okay, and then we have 2 in the back, and then we're done.
Clay Ramsey, Program on International Policy Attitudes. You were suggesting that there are pressures to go kinetic in a lot of circumstances where it would be best not to. Where do you think those pressures come from primarily, i.e. the Afghan government, the upper levels of the military, the middle levels of the military, etc.? Regarding polling, it's always been a problem that a national sample of Afghanistan gives a result that doesn't make sense to someone who spends a lot of time in a very kineticized area. But when it's possible to break out smaller regions from those polls, one does see those numbers go down. So kinetics do tend to depress the numbers that seem so positive and optimistic.
Hi, Brian Merrill. I spent a year working with ISAF in Kabul. You mentioned earlier that you think that governance has to be local. However, one of the key components of governance, which I would say would be security, seems to be something that would be required to be somewhat national. So far away from the capital in Helmand and Kandahar, how do you resolve those two?
Okay, and one final question, then you have 8 questions to answer in 8 minutes.
The last question is, could you make a comment about how you see the parliamentary election affecting overall stability, such as it is in Afghanistan this fall?
Okay. Forgive me if these are not very full answers. Mullah Salam. That's what the book is. A lot of this book is about Mullah Salam, and a few people have just bought it. So I'm not going to give away the end. Sort of like because he's very. What you get from the Musa Kala story is the reality of trying to do this reintegration, where intelligence is pretty poor. People who you think they're something don't turn out to be who you think they are, and Mullah Salam wasn't quite what people expected. But the key thing that emerged from that was everything about reintegration is about delivering political solutions and political change. And if the leadership of the country is not comfortable with that political change, then it's not going to succeed. And some of the promises of reintegration made by President Karzai so far have been insincere, because he's torpedoed an awful lot of reintegration. And that's the story that you get in Musa Kala and in other places. It's all about widening the tent. But if you want to rule by chosen representatives and with a narrow base, because that's how you can function, then reintegration is not going to succeed. So the story is about a battle fought at a local level, but all the chains and puppetry going on all the way back to Kabul. Generators to Kajaki, big operation. The latest I heard was that they weren't going to be used after all. The new one wasn't going to be used because they hadn't planned for the fact that they'd have to build a new set of power lines and provide the fuel, and that they weren't clear that they could build those power lines. So for the moment, the decision was not to have to send a lot of cement to finish the project. So despite this high-profile operation, big success in bringing up the first 2 out of 3 generators have made things a lot better, but the big operation to being the third one hasn't advanced, the last I heard. If not holding the where does it take us if by not holding the terrain the Taliban come back? Well, I think it's about demonstrating that the influence of government is for the good. It's not about, the problem is not so much that where we're not there is Taliban, because if that happens, then people can make their judgment about what the Taliban is like and can choose to react against that or call in the government ultimately. The problem that I've referred to is about these sweeps, highly kinetic operations that just move through an area, leave an impression that all we bring is violence and enhanced conflict. Agricultural Workers Programme. I don't know much about the specific program, but what I would just the only contact I've had with people involved in those programs is that they are very effective in the short term. But the major problem in the delivery of aid through USAID programs, so people on the ground involved in aid say, is very centralised and bureaucratic. So that whereas each village demands a different approach, they're being told they're not spending enough money on this area and spending too much in another area, and it's quite difficult to turn the ship around. There's too many people up in Kabul sort of shaping a grand strategy and not enough on the ground delivering local appropriate solutions. And I know that doesn't really answer your question, but that's all I really know. Why is there this pressure to go kinetic all the time? Because I think that it's about inappropriate forces. People are not entitled to fire when they feel under threat. The question is, should they be there in that particular spot in the first place? Why are there not Afghan forces with them to take on who have a better idea where, for example, the enemy is? And you've got forces that are quite tired after many years of conflict now, who are going to look after their men. But it's I think it's also a matter of understanding. And I was reading that thing that exchanged between Crystal and in the Rolling Stone piece about and that platoon, and I think he's right that it's the people who've shown great restraint, and they've taken the fruits of that. People, I think some Marines I was speaking to, who lived in a village, and when they got there, they showed enormous restraint, and that has delivered them security, which has kept people alive for the months that followed that they lived there. But it's a hard decision at the time to show that restraint, but that restraint can actually save people's lives in the long term. So it's about but this is tough stuff. And I take the point about the polling. Local government, nationals. The security is national, local, and you're talking about local. Well, I think there has to be locally delivered security. The forces that are being deployed and in which so much hope is invested, such as the Afghan National Army, are a national force, and they will never be seen as. I don't believe they will suppress a Pashtun rebellion in the south. I mean, there are increasing numbers of Pashtuns in them, but they're not generally from Kandahar and Helmand. So the search is on for appropriate Pashtun tribal forces. There are various experiments going on, and I think that enabling village security, enabling models for alternatives, non-corrupt alternatives to these national forces, to at least to hold ground, not necessarily to fight the big battles, is one of the ways forward. It has to be a way around it. But the key thing is that in a traditional model of ARBA, one of the models of the raising of local tribal forces locally is that Afghanistan has always had this patchwork of tribes, and the first stage is to bring those tribal groups together. But what we've had quite often is the arming of one particular group. If you like, the sort of rush to create this force goes ahead of the political process to bring people together, because unless that force has a consensus behind it, all it does is exacerbate the tribal conflict that's going on everywhere, which is driving this whole insurgency. And the parliamentary elections, I'll pass that one. Sorry, I don't know enough about the parliamentary elections. Sorry.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Stephen.